Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Helen Seslowski. I'm the events director for Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. A reminder that if you have any questions for our authors during the event, please type them into the chat, which you'll find at the right-hand side of your screen, or into the Q&A module, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the conversation portion of the program. We're so glad you could join us this evening for our annual YA Summer Reads panel, and we have such a great lineup for you tonight. Joining us is E. Lockhart with her new novel, Family of Liars. And we also have Melissa Albert with her book, Our Crooked Hearts. XiXi Tian with This Place is Still Beautiful. Isabel Ibañez with Together We Burn, and Sayantani DasGupta with Debating DARCY. So we have a full house tonight, all great summer reads. And a reminder to all of you attending that we'll be drawing from our participant list tonight to find out who wins an Oblong Books tote bag with all these great titles and an Oblong cup to keep your beach drinks cool. So stay tuned for that. We're going to advise you the winner tomorrow morning by email. We'll draw it tonight. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us. Moderating our panel this evening is Cecilia Cackley of First Book. If you don't know about First Book, it's a non-profit that's been providing new books, learning materials, and other essentials to children and schools in need since 1992. It's a fantastic organization, and I'm going to hand you over to Cecilia, who can tell you a little bit more about it and then talk to our authors about these fantastic books. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate that intro. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope that if you are in a place where it is very hot, that you are keeping cool, that you have all the lights lowered, you have something cool to drink, and you're ready to kick back with some fabulous books. So as Helen said, I am a book buyer for First Book, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. If you or someone you know is a teacher in a Title I school, or works for a program that works predominantly with families in need, you are eligible to become a member of our organization and have access to new reading materials and a whole bunch of other learning resources for very, very, very little money. So if you have not become a member with us and that describes you, you can go to fbmarketplace.org. I will drop that in the chat, and sign up for free. If you are not working with the Title I school, but you would like to support our efforts, I'll also drop our regular website, firstbook.org, into the chat, and anyone can donate and help us out. So we have books for all ages made available, and in several different languages as well. I feel very fortunate to be part of the buying team there, and to have this opportunity to talk to you all a little bit about it and to go into detail on these fabulous books. So we have 5 amazing authors tonight with excellent juicy reads for the summer of all genres. And so I'm just going to go through them one by one and hold them up if our authors want to quickly wave. Today we have Melissa Albert with Our Crooked Hearts. Oh, you have books too, haha, yay. Sayantani DasGupta with Debating DARCY. Isabel Ibañez with Together We Burn. E. Lockhart with Family of Liars. I almost held up the first one and then I remembered. And XiXi Tian with This Place is Still Beautiful. All right. So I'm gonna jump straight in. Oh, and a reminder just that copies of all these titles can be purchased at Oblong Books in either Rhinebeck or Millerton and online. Highly recommend. You can also find them at your local library. Or if they are not at your local library, please ask them to purchase it, and then you can check it out. So I'm just going to go in order and ask you each to say something briefly about you and about your book. Just give us a little background about your story, and I'm going to go in alphabetical order again. So Melissa, will you kick us off?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Good. Okay. A kid intrusion, but now I'm good. Yes, I am Melissa Albert. I am the author of the Hazelwood books, as well as Our Crooked Hearts, which is a witchy YA contemporary fantasy that came out just a few weeks ago. And this is a book that is set half in the suburbs of Chicago, where I grew up, and half in the city of Chicago, where I was an adult. And I am really excited to be launching it in summertime for once, because I've only had winter books. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Melissa. Sayantani, will you go next?
Sure. I'm Sayantani DasGupta, and you might know me for my Kieran Mala and the Kingdom Beyond series, but Debating Darcy is my YA debut because it is a big, step in a different direction from my Bengali folktale and string theory based middle grade series. Debating Darcy is basically a story I've been afraid to write for a really long time because I am a giant Jane Austen fan. If anyone has opinions on the latest Netflix Persuasion movie, I have many opinions. I am happy to discuss them at length. But this is a story I've been longing to write for a really long time. It's a contemporary YA reimagining of my favorite Austen, Pride and Prejudice, set, of course, in the high stakes world of high school speech and debate. Because if anything else, Lizzie and Darcy debate their way into falling in love in the original book. And I figured, hey, high school speech and debate kids, why not? And that's, it's a kind of witty and fast-paced rom-com with a lot of love for Austen in there.
Thank you. Isabel?
I'm Isabel Ibañez. I'm the author of Woven in Moonlight, Written in Starlight, and Together We Burn, which just came out on May 31st. It's the story of Sarela, who is the daughter of a famous flamenco dancer and draganador, which is kind of like a matador, but instead of facing bulls in the arena, they face dragons. It's got a lot of heart, kissing, adventure, and delicious food.
Thank you. Emily?
Family of Liars is set on a private island off the coast of Massachusetts. It's the same setting as my previous novel, We Were Liars, but Family of Liars is a prequel set many years earlier. So it's a different generation of young women in the Sinclair family. And these three young women are spending the summer on this private island, just like they have every summer. It's beautiful, it's kind of magical, but it's also very isolated. And their lives are upended when a literal boatload of cute boys and one girl shows up on the island and basically takes over the guest house.
Thank you. And last but not least, Cece.
Hi, I'm Cece. This Place is Still Beautiful is my debut novel of any genre. It's in YA, and it's about two sisters, biracial Chinese-American sisters, Margaret and Annalie, and their house gets vandalized by a racial slur. Someone spray paints the word chinks on their garage door, and it's about the fallout and aftermath in their own family in reaction to that, as well as to the community, as well as the community at large. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. I really love that we have also just such a wide range, not just of books, not just of genres, but of authors, just in some of your debuts, people who've been in the YA community for a really long time, many of you in between. And it's not always not always every day that we get to have that on a panel. So that's pretty awesome. Just a reminder to everyone watching that as we go through our discussion, if you have questions for the authors, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I'm depending on you to come up with fun things to say and ask them about. So first of all, our first topic of conversation, all of your books in one way or another are family stories. All of your books have very strong families, very powerful families, families that face challenges either apart or together. So I'd ask each of you to talk a little bit about why family is so important to your main character, and also what challenges their family might present for them. Let's see, we're going to start with fantasy. Isabel, will you kick us off?
Yes, I'd love to. So the main character, Sarela, she is the only daughter of two high-performing parents. And she inherited just this long-standing tradition of dragon fighting. And I got the idea for Together We Burn because I've got a lot of family in Spain, and on a family vacation, my cousins took me to a bullfight, and I did not have a good time. But the idea sparked. The main thing that I wanted to do was to ask a question of whether or not somebody could honor where they've been, honor their tradition and respect their past, but maybe reimagine a tradition moving forward. And Sarela has inherited this just this loyalty and this culture in her family of respecting this tradition. And so when she starts to be confronted on how this may not be the best thing for the society, for the city that she's in, for her family, she starts really pushing against a lot of ideals that she's been fed her entire life. So while she is trying to ask this question, I think that there is this tension with her family as she's kind of stretching and leaving the home for the first time and taking on a lot more responsibility for her ancestral arena. And
yeah. One of the things that I really loved about your book was how it, took two elements of Spanish culture that are so incredibly iconic with just the dancing, but also bullfighting, and managed, to bring them together. I don't think if you had said, oh, do you think you could put both of those things into a book and make it make sense? It would be like, no, not at all. And you did it so beautifully.
Oh, thanks.
So I really enjoyed that a lot, bringing those two elements together. Melissa, will you tell a little bit about yours?
Yeah, so my book, Our Crooked Hearts, kind of centers around two girls. And the first is Dana, and she's coming of age in 1990 Chicago. And the other is her daughter, Ivy, who 25 years later is coming of age in the Chicago suburbs and kind of discovering that all of this weirdness that has taken place in her life is kind of coming to a head. And she recognizes that it has to do with something her mother did when she herself was 16 years old. So I think of Dana's story as kind of having that classic paranormal arc of like, the paranormal YA we loved as teens, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And then her daughter's story is kind of dealing with the aftermath of that. So it's definitely a story of magic with costs that like reverberate down generations, and that idea of like what a legacy can be and how kind of twisted and fun that can be to play with the idea of like legacy in a family with like magic in its roots. So it's also about the idea that when you're a teenager, the family you live in is like, it's like a culture you can only help to create, but like your parents kind of create the reality you live in. And I think that's such an interesting space for a person to be in. And it's definitely reflected in all my books, that idea of like, you're born into a family for better or worse. And I find that like a really interesting thing to play with.
Awesome. That was an incredibly great segue, because you're born into a family for better or for worse, I think is just like the perfect lead in for Emily's book. So hi, I'm turning it over to you.
Yeah, that's true. Family of Liars is a lot about the kind of boxes into which families can put their children. Like, the simple way of thinking about it is, this is the smart one, this is the pretty one, this is the talented one, this is the one who doesn't do well in school, right? And even when those things are compliments, they can be very limiting to a person's sense of self. And because the Sinclair family is an old money, white, democratic family of landowners, the box they put their kids in is pretty small. It's pretty tight. It's, the family motto is be a credit to the family. And what that means is whatever you do reflects back on us. So, when you go out in the world, you stay in that box and do what our family has always done. So even though it's like super different from Isabel's book, it's the same struggle, right? Like that, this is what your family does. This is how your family is. This is what they expect of you. And I think that's one of the fundamental questions of a lot of YA, right? Is how do you break with the culture of your family and still love them in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so interesting because, I read your book and XiXi's book back to back, which was really, really interesting because your characters are so different. And yet on that aspect of who do I want to be, who does my family want me to be, and who am I, what is my role within my family? Your main characters felt very, very much in conversation. So XiXi, would you tell us a little bit about yours?
Yeah, I think that Emily had it right in that a lot of YA like deals with some of these same issues because when you're growing up, like sort of navigating your family and your relationships with the different people in your family is like a core part of your coming of age struggle. And in my book, there's a couple of critical family relationships. So it's about two sisters. So the sibling relationship is like at the core of the book. It's told in dual perspective between the two sisters. And then there's also the relationship with their mother. And I think that both of those are very fraught. They're all very fraught relationships. I think that like, especially in, at least in my experience in Asian American families, like family is very important. And then also like finding who you are in your particular family, the expectations of who you should be in your family are really challenging to navigate when you're a teenager. And between the two siblings, I sort of cast them as like opposites, as a lot of siblings often are. And I put a lot of my own relationship with my brother into that sister relationship of having two people who were born into the same family and love each other because they are related, but they don't like each other very much because they're so different. And if they weren't in the same family, they probably would hate each other and like never talk to each other and would definitely not be friends. And so sort of navigating like when something really traumatic happens to the family, the two of them have like extremely different way of hoping the family handles that. And sort of like as the book goes on, the two of them are trying to figure out like who's in the right and like how they can like respect each other's approaches toward dealing with that particular situation. But yeah, like my brother and I just like really, really hated each other when we were growing up. And we get along much better now that we don't live under the same roof. So I think that helps out a lot of sibling relationships.
I mean, yeah, that's definitely true for my family. So for our last book, Debating Darcy, obviously, Pride and Prejudice is a very quintessential family story. It has the original has a lot of sisters in it. But Sayantani, will you tell us a little bit about how you reinterpreted that for a modern audience?
Absolutely. So, in answer a little bit to what XiXi was just saying about kind of Asian American families and expectations of Asian American parenting, I'll just say really quickly that when I was first submitting my very first book for young people, The Serpent's Secret, it was a middle grade fantasy. It was about like kind of a kick butt girl from New Jersey and her immigrant parents. And a lot of the feedback I would get would be, well, we don't really understand this brown girl in a fantasy. And why not write about, her oppressive parents and her struggles against her oppressive parents, right? There's this expectation that, stories about brown girls or South Asian girls or Middle Eastern girls or what have you have to be about this struggle. And so I've always been very, very conscious about writing supportive, progressive immigrant parents into all my stories, which mine are, but it's also a political choice, right, for me to write that way because I was so furious that that was the expectation. So in Debating Darcy, we have two kids of immigrants. Maybe you can see them behind me. I don't know which way I'm going. So Leela Bose is my Lizzie Bennett. She's the daughter of Bengali Indian immigrants to the US. And she comes from a pretty middle class family. Her father lost his job. They had to move to a different town. And in this new town, she goes to a public school, Longbourn High, and she meets a kind of chaotic theatrical crew who become her chosen family. They're her speech and debate team. And so instead of five sisters of the original Pride and Prejudice, we have this chaotic crew of multicultural folks who are her speech and debate team. And then, of course, her enemy, eventual love interest, is Feroz Darcy, who is the son of a Pakistani immigrant woman who has become the president of Pemberley University, which is a Princeton-like university, and a British man, an immigrant also to the US, who's passed away. But he comes from a much more privileged background. His mother's the president of a university. He goes to a private Netherfield Academy. So there's that kind of class conflict that's in Pride and Prejudice that comes out. And the other kind of family/immigrant dynamic that's at play for folks familiar with the South Asian kind of subcontinent is, of course, this is also a Hindu-Muslim romance, even though that's not a primary issue you kind of brought to the fore. So yeah, chosen family and also super supportive immigrant parents.
Thank you all. So I'm going to turn the discussion a little more towards craft, because one of the other things that your books have in common is secrets. There are a lot of secrets and reveals in all of your books. They drive the plot. So without any spoilers, because we of course do not want to spoil the reading experience for anyone, I'm curious if you can each tell us a little bit about the craft of building a secret into the narrative. So when you are, you're putting that into the plot, how do you choose what to reveal, what to hide, what your protagonist knows versus what your reader knows, and those decisions. And this time I'm going to go in a completely different order. Emily, will you start us off?
Well, I've somehow managed to get known for having unreliable narrators, but I honestly don't really feel that that's the case for the most part. And the reason is a craft reason, that if the narrator, in my case, first person narrator, but also in like Genuine Fraud, it's a third person narrator, is deliberately lying or holding back information, there's an erosion of trust that happens when you get to the reveal. You think, why on earth did this person just fib to me in order to make a plot twist happen? And I really don't like that. And so in We Were Liars, it's a first person narrator, but she is telling you everything she knows as she knows it. And that I was very consistent throughout that, the novel, in order to try to not give, I know some people hated this book and like threw it across the room in fury, but I was trying for that not to happen, and trying to create the plot twist without creating a feeling of betrayal. And in Family of Liars, I handled it in a different way, where the narrator is trying to tell you what she knows, and she tells you that she is trying and that it is extremely hard for her to tell you. So she does hold back some information, but she tells you the truth through a number of fairy tales that she spins off into, which happens in Liars too. So I use the fairy tales as a way for her to confess the truth of the story when she's not yet ready yet to confess the truth, and thereby hopefully keep that reader's trust. But I'm also winging it. Like, I don't know like how to do this. I just try.
CeCe, your book has two different narrators, because we do get both perspectives from the two sisters in the book. So how did you approach their sort of differing, levels of knowledge around what has happened and reactions to what has happened at their house and in their town?
Yeah, the story always started out with two narrators, and I think that it's really an interesting way. I like using it in a way to sort of create suspense for the reader, in that you can sort of like pause a storyline for a second and then like move to a different scenario, and like the reader gets left in a place where they sort of have to like hang on for a little bit before, and then go to like a different angle before they like go back to the other sister's perspective and like get a little bit more information. I was on the point of like hiding like a secret. I always like really struggle with that while writing, because I think that my goal in writing is to be able to, when there is like some kind of secret is revealed later on in the book, that it is both surprising, but also not so surprising that it feels like it's completely unearned. So you have to kind of like breadcrumb it a little bit, so that when it happens, you're like, oh yeah, that like totally makes sense. It's like, I was not expecting that, but now that it's happened, it like makes sense. And I think that the only way that I can really accomplish that is just by going through multiple drafts and rereading and then being like, is it too obvious this time? Try to cut some stuff out. If it's like not obvious enough, then you'll like breadcrumb some stuff back in. And it's like kind of like you're walking like a tightrope while you're writing it in that way. But I don't know if I've like successfully achieved it, but that's like usually how I approach it.
I really like that description of breadcrumbs, also because it sounds very fairy tale-ish. So Melissa, your book in some ways is doing similar things to XiXi's in the sense that you have two different perspectives that we're getting, but you're also switching time periods and your general timeline. So yeah, what was it like trying to keep or in that all in order?
Oh man, it was so fun, to be honest. So basically in my front half, in my contemporary half, I have a girl who is puzzled as to why all these weird things keep happening to her and what's the deal with her mom. And then in the back 90s half, I have her mom kind of showing you step by step how she became the person she is. So weaving those two and kind of like putting them in dialogue with each other was a lot of fun. And I really tried to, first I just wrote them all the way through. And then when it came to like weaving them together, I had to, I forget who said it, but like cutting things that seemed too obvious and like burying others, while always, avoiding that sense that the reader might have that you're deliberately withholding. Like, I can't stand that as a reader when you feel like the twist depends on someone simply, gotcha. I absolutely love Lockhart's books, and they are the definition of earned in terms of their twists. But I've seen it done differently, and I knew that I wanted to kind of seed it, but not really hold the wool over your eyes in that way. So doing it with two narratives was actually kind of a fun way to do it, because you could kind of pick and choose what you focus on in the two different timelines.
I did want to pass along a compliment on your book. So one of the other things I do is I run a book club for teens where they get to read books ahead of publication and make recommendations to the bookstore that I used to work at. They are affectionately known as the murder teens because, as they say, we like it when people die in books. But so they are very, very into murder mysteries and have lots of opinions about twists and whether or not you can see things coming. But the teen who did read Our Crooked Hearts told me that it was one of her favorite books that she'd ever read in the club. And she is an incredibly picky reader. So I wanted to make sure that I passed that along. It was very, very high compliment from a discerning reader. So Isabel, but with Together We Burn, you have this, again, very classic, as you said, classic fantasy arc of a girl struggling to support her family. And we know from the beginning that something is going on behind the scenes. So tell us a little bit about how you decided, again, with the breadcrumbs, when things were going to happen and when we were going to find out, the reason behind it all.
I feel like I've been listening to everybody and I've been nodding, just agreeing, because it is hard to hold the tension of what to reveal and what to keep a secret, and nothing irritates me more than anything that a secret has been withheld for a very thin reason. So I realized with Together We Burn, there were multiple secrets that I was kind of juggling, and I ended up prioritizing a few. And to me, I made some creative choices, but there is a very big secret at the heart of Together We Burn. It's one of them. And I just had the person who was keeping the secret say, yes, I'm keeping a secret, and here's why. And this is the reason. And for me, as a reader, I've been like, oh, okay, that makes total sense. I understand. Okay, I have no idea what it could be, but I understand your motives behind that. So for me, it was revealing a character motivation. And then as the other secrets, I feel like I kind of like what Emily was talking about, but in the sense that when Cecilia is moving through her journey, the arc, she finds out information, she processes them. Wow, that's a hard thing to say. Okay. And so as she's going through, she learns things and she thinks about them, and she knows what she knows, right? Like she's investigating, she's trying to figure out who would have wanted to sabotage her ancestral home, who would have wanted to do such harm to her family. And I think that it's okay to reveal clues, because I do like when a secret is revealed, that it does not come out of the blue. It does not make sense. It's not logical, and it doesn't fit in with the rest of the plot that you have been taking so much care to work through. So it's still really like, it's a hard juggling act for sure. And I probably, like, with so many secrets and Together We Burn, I just have to pick and choose, like, okay, what am I revealing, but what's really important that needs to really be hidden, and for what reason? And that's what I did.
Yeah. So Sayantani, it seems kind of silly for me to be talking about secrets with a book that, you know, the story of which we have known for a couple hundred years now. And yet every Pride and Prejudice retelling, and there are so many, and I enjoy them all, I will admit that up front, you know, takes a different angle, and each author has to make choices about what elements of the plot and the story you choose to emphasize, you choose to de-emphasize, how you're going to interpret it for your particular age range, setting, family, etc. So can you talk a little bit about the decisions that you made in your specific reinterpretation?
Sure. And yeah, it is different to deal with secrets that everyone knows who is familiar with this well-loved book, or any of its, you know, 1 zillion movie interpretations and television interpretations. And yet, in reimagining it in Pride and Prejudice in a contemporary setting, for the first maybe 2/3, for the first like 2 acts of the book, I stayed pretty much with the beats of Pride and Prejudice, where you know, the protagonists of Pride and Prejudice meet at balls, and we don't tend to go to quite as many balls in our modern era, I find. So my protagonists meet at speech and debate tournaments. And just when I was in high school, you know, every other weekend we go to a different high school for a speech and debate tournament. And that's kind of how the beats of the balls in Pride and Prejudice, the dances, happen in the first 2/3 of my book. The last third of my book, I really had to think, you know, in the original Pride and Prejudice, the youngest sister of Lizzie, you know, our main character, kind of makes some very rash decisions that I'm not sure Jane Austen punishes her for so much in the text, but in the 1813 context, a 15-year-old kind of running away with a man, with a lover, really can't be, you know, called out in the same way that it can be called out in 2022. And I knew that I wanted to do something with that secret. I wanted to do something with the fact that Wickham in the original novel is in his 20s or 30s, and he is a serial kind of chaser of 15-year-olds. And I knew that I didn't want to kind of let that slide. I didn't want to let that go. And so I had to make a decision in terms of, you know, am I going to keep secret the way that the characters in my book deal with and confront and kind of use their voices to call out this inappropriate kind of toxic masculinity, for lack of a better word, this kind of inappropriate behavior? How do I reveal it? When do I reveal it? Does my main character, Leela, kind of interpret Lydia as the person who's at fault, or does she take her side right away? How long does it take Leela to kind of take her side? So those were the decisions that I kind of had to make in the last third of the book, where I really did deviate a lot from Pride and Prejudice.
Thank you. So we often joke that, you know, parents are absent from Kidlit. There are a lot of orphans seemingly around every corner, but that's changing. And especially in YA, we're seeing a lot more, you know, caregiver, parent-child relationships being central, and they are very important in each of your books. So I'm curious to know, do you think that it's important for readers to see complicated parent relationships in fiction? And if so, why is that? Isabel, will you start?
Yes. because it's a very human thing. I think it's so important. We all have complicated relationships with someone in our life. And sometimes that does happen to be, you know, the people who are parenting us. And for Sarala in particular, I think it's not a huge spoiler. You find out at the back of the book, or in the prologue, but she loses her mom in a very traumatic way. And afterward, she's kind of living in her mom's shadow, and her father really enforces that. He really wants her to be what his wife was, in the sense of her accomplishments, what she favored, how the performances that she gave as this flamenco dancer, to not deviate from routines, to not create new dance moves or anything like that. He has really wanted to put her, this is the road to success. This is what your mother did. You're going to do exactly the same thing. And I think it's really natural to represent, you know, that push and pull of wanting to be your own person, but then also wanting to, because family is so important, but wanting to respect her dad. So I absolutely think it's so important to show those kinds of relationships. And for me to include that, it was really integral into Sarela's emotional arc. So I felt like I had to tell that story about how she became her own person.
Awesome. Thank you. Cece, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your relationship with your parents is obviously, for most people, a pretty fraught one when you're a teenager. And I think that in my book, Mama is an immigrant parent from China, which, so not only is there a generational difference, there's also like a cultural difference in terms of how she grew up and how her children are growing up. And I had that same kind of relationship with my parents. And when you have like a lot of like heightened emotions, when you're a teenager, and there's sort of the weight of expectation from your parents in terms of like what they experienced growing up, and then like trying to like make sure that you have the best life possible from their perspective, you're going to like end up inevitably like butting heads. And I think it's very hard for either side to sort of see where the other person is coming from, and that is the source of like a lot of disagreements. And I think that it's hard to give the other person the benefit of the doubt when you're in that kind of situation. And so the girls have a really difficult relationship with Mama as well, because in the story, as she's like a single mother, the two sisters sort of like, there's like an underlying dynamic of also like one of the sisters sort of feeling like, oh, Mama always got along better with the other sister. And so in that like 3-person triangle relationship, like navigating the emotions there is a really critical part of the story, as the two sisters try to figure out who they are, independent of like what their mother's expectation is of them, and also playing off like what their sibling is hoping that how they should behave in a particular situation. And I just think it is really important to include those like parental relationships in YA books, because like sometimes when you're like reading them as a teenager, it sort of like makes you feel more seen about your own relationship with your parents. And as I've like grown older, I think that like my relationship with my own parents has also evolved from like how I felt when I was a teenager versus like now I actually like just had a child, and now I'm a mother for the first time, and like now my relationship with my mother is quite different as well. I think that like this very critical relationship in your coming of age is it's just like it's not terribly true to life when you're a teenager if you're not seeing like what like someone's relationship with their parent in a particular story in most cases. So yeah, I think that like parent-children relationship will always be something that's really featured in my stories, because it was like I butted heads with my parents so much when I was a teen. And I think that like that's always going to be the case for every generation for one reason or another. And it's going to be different for different families, but like that tension like often exists. So
yeah. Melissa, in some ways, I think yours is the most central, I guess I would say, just because we get both perspectives. So you want to tell us a little?
Yeah. So when I started writing this book, I wanted to write a suburban fantasy. So I set it in the suburbs of my youth and gave it kind of like that creepy Lynchian suburban vibe that I love to read and write about. But as I was writing, I kept on trying all these different engines of magic. Like I knew it was a fantasy novel, but nothing I was trying to plug in was working until I had my character sit down with her mother and like have this conversation. And as I was drafting, I realized I wanted to know the mom's backstory. And then as I started digging into that, I suddenly had like 40,000 words of unusable backstory, unless I re-envisioned the whole book as like a dual timeline story. And that's when I realized what the magic was and what the story was. And that allowed me to center the narrative on a pretty hefty betrayal, I'll say. And it's something that I don't think I could have written without giving half of the book to the mother character, because I don't think that you can read the story and have any chance of understanding how and why she came to the point she did without really seeing her built kind of from the ground out. So I just love that idea of giving a character the fullness of half a book, right? To kind of convince you, walk the road with her, and then you can judge. It's kind of my thought. Plus, it gave me a chance to write a witchy narrative in 1990 Chicago, which was like too fun to resist.
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, it really is absolute genius because, obviously 90s are historical fiction now, which I know that I'm probably not the only one who's struggling with. But you're like, oh, I don't want to necessarily write a historical fiction book, but I really want it to be in the 90s. So, I can just write the parent story. That makes sense generationally.
And I'm reading, just really quickly, I'm reading Maureen New's Throwback right now, and she does something similar, and it's genius, and everyone should put that on their list.
Good to know. Sayantani, you already said a little bit about your motivations in terms of writing specific parents to your story, but anything else you would like to add to that?
Yeah, sorry, I answered that question earlier.
That's fine.
So I grew up in a very progressive activist household, and I feel like when we tell, I think it's tricky for those of us who don't find ourselves in our communities really well represented yet in YA literature, right? Because it's really tricky. We have to walk that fine line of, do I want to tell this story that potentially leans into certain expectations about parents or families or my community that people can use in racist ways then against my community, right? And so that's, I think, a really tricky line to walk. I think about Ms. Marvel, if folks have seen it on Disney Plus, and just how that character had conflict with her parents, but her parents and community were ultimately also very three-dimensional and loving and dynamic and vibrant. And so that's kind of my goal, is to, not sugarcoat it. Clearly there's conflict and there's growing up that's happening, and, in families that causes conflict. But also to be very conscious of the very few positive representations of my community and parents and immigrant parents that are out there, and really think about how to portray those in three-dimensional ways. So Ma and Baba, Leela's parents in this book, are hilarious and adorable and wear like 80s exercise outfits and like encourage each other to like do Jane Fonda-esque exercise videos, and and then they go to meet Darcy's mom, and they have a lovely South Indian lunch, even though nobody's South Indian, but they're all DC, so they do that. So we have kind of touching, typical parent moments, and conflict within that, but the love, and the kind of vibrancy of the parents and the community are there.
Yeah, thank you. And so, Emily, your book, because it's a prequel, we really are delving into the idea of parent, but parent before they were parent, in some respects, and yet at the same time, the entire book is being told as a story by a parent to a kid. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the whole parent-child relationship.
Well, I think that part of it is really very sentimental. Carrie, the narrator, starts out telling the story of her 17th summer to her son, who's asking her. And not to be spoilerish if you haven't read We Were Liars, but there's a lot of emotion going on in the telling of this story and in his asking of the questions about her childhood. And so yeah, I think in that sense, like the whole book is a mom trying to explain herself to her kid. And that's an unusual thing for YA, I think. But I ended up feeling that I needed the frame story. I could have just started without that frame. But I felt like I needed the frame story to connect it to the previous book. Then it created a situation where the emotionality behind the entire story was higher.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. Okay, just a reminder to everybody watching that we are getting close to our Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them either in the chat or in the Q&A box. You have just a little bit more time, please, to think of them and drop them in there. So Melissa actually already kind of started jumping the gun on this question. But what I do love to ask everyone on any virtual event, because as we all know, bookish people are the best people to ask for book recommendations. So what is something that you either are reading, just finished reading, are about to start reading that you would recommend? And why should we all be excited about it? Does anyone want to go first? Great, Sayantani, go.
Grace Lee, who is a lovely, lovely person. Her debut is Portrait of a Thief. I just finished it. And speaking of immigrant communities and diasporic nostalgia, the book is a heist about a group of Chinese American young folks who are hired to kind of repatriate Chinese artifacts from various museums around the world. And their arcs are essentially all about their own families and their own kind of levels of nostalgia with China and what it means to be Chinese American, and kind of the creation of the diaspora as like a third identity. And I just loved those aspects of it. It was so good.
I was actually just thinking about that book because I just read an interview with the head of New York's like antiquities theft division, like basically a real life, I don't know where, I can't remember exactly what his title is, like through the attorney's office or whatever, whose job is to catch criminals who are trying to steal and sell art stolen from other countries and repatriate it to where it came from. And it was an absolutely fascinating article, but specifically set against the fictional heist of Portrait of a Thief. I was like, oh, real and fiction. It's amazing. Love that. Let's see, Isabel, will you go next?
Yes, I finished in one day 6 Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. Oh my gosh, her writing is so beautiful. It reads like a fairy tale. And she talks about food. I was so hungry reading it, and there is just so much lore. And so I got an arc of the book 2 and the Dragon's Promise, and I'm about to start it, and I cannot wait. Cannot wait. So highly recommend 6 Crimson Cranes, and then pre-order, please, the Dragon's Promise.
Awesome. Love to have something to pre-order.
Yeah, always.
Emily, what about you?
I'm so excited because I just bought Portrait of a Thief, so I'm glad to hear that it's so good. Well, I did a lot of book touring around this season, and I did events with, I feel like I did events with every YA thriller writer live. That's not accurate, but it did feel like that. And I read all the books when I was doing, events with single people. You're just the two of you need to read their books. And my very favorite, I will reveal, which is Victoria Lee's A Lesson in Vengeance.
Oh, yeah.
Victoria described it at our event as witchy murder lesbians at boarding school. And that is a pretty accurate description. So if that is your jam, I thought it was like, it's really erudite, like all kinds of amazing literary references that I thought were so cleverly layered in. Great dark boarding school, dark academia type of atmosphere. I really loved it.
Awesome. Melissa, you already told us one, but tell us another one.
always ready to tell you more. So I just finished Gabriel Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which is about two video game developers and their friendship over the course of like 2 decades or so. And it's, oh my God. I mean, people kept saying how fantastic it was. It didn't like at a glance sound like my jam, as not a video game player myself. But once I was in it, I adored it. I read it in about a day and a half. It's just this really big, empathetic book that has so much to say about like the act of creation. It's like full of really great writing advice. So if you are a writer or a creative of any kind, or you just love a page turner, I would highly recommend it.
Awesome. Good timing too. And Cece, what would you recommend?
I just picked up, I was at a conference in June for the American Booksellers Association, and I picked up a bunch of advanced reader copies, and I just finished reading Each Night Was Illuminated by Jodi Lynn Anderson, who is one of my favorite authors, and it's coming out this fall. And I feel like every one of her books is just like wildly different than her other books, so you just like have no idea what's going to come next. But this one is about a girl who's sort of like started to lose her belief in religion and like in magical things in general. And she starts suffering from like intense insomnia, and she starts hanging out with this guy who at night to ghost hunt with him because he believes he's going to be able to catch some spirits in like in this like old haunted house. And it's like a very atmospheric book. It's not, I feel like I'm kind of selling it as like this like mystery book, but it's definitely more of like a slow going sort of like it's the writing is so beautiful. It has a lot of messages in it, believe it or not, about climate change. And I think it was just like a really good read. And as somebody who had a lot of insomnia and was also not sleeping very much at night because I had a baby, and so I was awake at night a lot, it was just a really good book to read about people who also are not sleeping and doing things in the middle of the night. So I really loved it and would definitely recommend when it comes out.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we have some audience questions. So our first question comes from Aziza, who asks, if you could write a futuristic YA version of a classic, what would it be and why? And just to say, for anybody who's into the Jane Austen retellings, there is a sci-fi persuasion version by Diana Peterfront, which I am blanking slightly on the name of. It's got stars.
For Darkness Shows the Stars.
For Darkness Shows the Stars. There we go. I knew it had darkness and stars, and I couldn't remember the ones in between. Thank you. Futuristic persuasion in space. Love it. What would you do?
I think
Probably Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, because to me, I'm always really interested in class and so-called class mobility and what that means in America, where class is supposedly more invisible than it is in Great Britain in the 19th century. And that is my favorite. Well, I have a lot of beloved Dickens novels, but in terms of thinking about class and the effect that attempts on class mobility have on an individual, I find it so fascinating. And I've referred to it in a lot of my books, but I've never tackled a full-on Dickens reimagining, and I would love to do that.
Can I just speak, because the reason, Emily, that I am so drawn to reimagining Austen is for the same reason, is for kind of thinking about class and how does, class and economics and, I had to reinterpret it as private public school, but certainly among immigrant communities, then there's that additional layering of, well, are you this kind of immigrant? Or are you that kind of immigrant? Were you able to access this, or were you able, were you not? Are your people driving taxis, or are your people presidents of universities? So for me too, I would love to do, my next YA is Shakespeare Meets Sense and Sensibility. It's like a Regency camp where multicultural kids are trying out for a Bridgerton-like show. But if I could put that book in space, my editor would absolutely kill me. But if I could, Regency camp in space, the book's already in copy edit, so it's not happening. But I would do Regency camp in space. That's what I would do.
There can be a sequel 300 years in the future. It would work.
She would totally kill me at this point, but.
Did any of you go to LA Times Book Festival this year?
Mm-mm.
Were you in the hotel with the Bridgerton experience?
Yes,
Ooh.
I was.
Oh
and did I go down by myself for research? Yes, I did.
Yes. So it's this beautiful old hotel that is maybe in a little disrepair. Like, it's just, they haven't renovated it, but it has these really grand lobby spaces and even ballroom type of spaces. And and there was a Bridgerton experience. And so at the bar, there were like a million ladies in like Empire waist dresses with huge wigs, and gentlemen in their, I mean, it was unbelievable. And sort of, to me, very thrilling, because all of these people had taken so much time and energy to dress up to simulate a fictional world that meant so much to them. Do you know what I mean? It was like the best compliment you could ever give a storyteller. And I just found it it was raucous, and they were drunk and everything, but it was amazing.
Completely agree. And like, I was very nervous to go down by myself, but I was like, I'm doing research. I'm writing this book about a Regency camp. I'm doing research. So I like made myself go. Introverted me only lasted like 15 minutes, and I ran away, but it was great.
I had somebody I knew to hang out with, so I was there for a long time, and I was the best people were watching ever.
Isabel, what would you rewrite?
I've been sitting here. I love the classics. I've never figured out how to do it. I mean, I love Jane Eyre. I love Tess of the Dubervilles. I love, I love The Women in White by Wilkie Collins. Has anyone read that? Classic ghost story. So great. How would that work in space in like 300 years in the future? I have no idea, but I think it's a fun, like super fun. But if final answer, I think I would do maybe The Woman in White. I love that story.
Awesome. Let's see, XiXi?
So I cheated and Googled 100 must-read classics so that I could scroll through them quickly and be like, what is something that could be transformed into like a futuristic setting? And I think my answer is probably that I would want to do Frankenstein, but like with AI instead of like an actual body. It was the one that actually that popped in my mind as I was scrolling through all of the 100 classics. So my day job is that I work as a lawyer at YouTube, and I am just like really fascinated with AI, and it's just like so amazing but also scary what technology can do these days. And so I think it could be like a really interesting retelling. I cannot do it, like somebody else should do that, but like I would like to read that.
Melissa, how about you?
Ooh, I've been racking my brains for something that would work futuristic, and I don't think I have a sci-fi brain, so I can't quite get there. But I'm obsessed with 12 Dancing Princesses retellings, and there's a lot set in like that classic fairy tale era that I adore. And then there's an amazing one set in like 1920s kind of prohibition era flappers that I love. But maybe like a contemporary retelling, like how would that work? Because it's my favorite fairy tale, and it's like a tricky one. And I think I would like to figure out a way to retell that contemporary times, but not the future.
Very cool. I will also note, just for anyone watching, that if you're interested in reimagined classics, as well as, Debating Darcy obviously is a fabulous example, but we do have an entire series from Macmillan children's books called Remixed Classics, which have been coming out for the past year, which are reimaginings of various classics. And the upcoming one that will be out in over a month is Self-Made Boys by Anna Marie McLemore, which is a reimagining of The Great Gatsby with trans characters. And it is super, super fun. Okay, our next question comes from Brooke, who asks, how did each of you come up with the ideas for your books? I am an aspiring writer who struggles with organizing ideas. Any tips? Isabel.
I'm so sorry. I have to go. I have
You need to
another
run.
at 8 o'clock. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you. It was so great seeing you guys and virtually meeting all of you. Bye.
Likewise.
Bye.
Okay, we're going to run through our last two questions here. Any tips for coming up with ideas?
Do you mind if I go first? Because
Please.
I should take advantage of when my kid is not running in here, so I'll hurry. So for our Crooked Hearts, I grew the seed of the story came from the idea of genre. So the genre and the place. So it was like suburban fantasy. And from there, it was just a matter of a lot of drafting and a lot of trial and error. And it was kind of like, it was my pandemic book. And I figured like, this is the one thing I have to do when my kid is asleep. I'm gonna spend my time on it. And it was almost like a test. What is the smallest seed you can grow a story from? And I think it was like a satisfying proof that it can be pretty small. So I think really anything that compels you to sit down and write, no matter how small, could become something huge once you like give it your time and attention.
I love that.
I'm also someone who is not very good at coming up with ideas. I don't come up with a lot of ideas. And so I think that for me, I had another author on a different panel say that she was like a big believer in the back brain, which I never heard anyone express it that way before. But I really also like the idea of the back brain. So it's basically like if I come up with an idea and it's still sitting with me like a year later and like going on in the back of my head, then I feel like it's enough that I can write a story off of it. So when I come up with an idea, I try not to write it like right away. I try to like see which ideas are able to survive the test of time of something that I'm still like thinking about over like a long period of time. And I think that like somehow your subconscious or the back brain actually does some work on that story if it like continues to stick with you. And like if you're not consciously thinking about plotting it all the time, I think sometimes like it actually like can flower and grow in your mind a little bit better. And that's just like, again, I come up with like maybe like 2 ideas a year. And so like that's how I determine like whether something is like worth writing later on.
Emily.
Well, I was just gonna say I struggle with this too, in case that's any consolation. Like I've written, I think 55 books and I can't think of one right now at all. So it's very normal part of the process, I think, for a lot of people, even people who have published a lot of books, that sometimes you feel just sort of dried up, or you feel like you're flailing around with 700 ideas, or nothing, you have these ideas, but they don't want to kind of manifest into proper stories. And sometimes the thing you have to do is just start to write, which is kind of the opposite of what XiXi was saying, but it's not that I'm disagreeing with you. I'm just saying there's another angle, which is, if you brainstorm or you just try to write like this, you don't necessarily have to start writing the novel, but you write out the plot, like this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Sometimes if you just keep at it for like a solid hour, even though sometimes you're writing, I have no idea what happens next. I don't know who these characters are. I don't know, but you're just kind of doing a word vomit. I've often found that gets the back brain to go. So forcing myself to start writing, even when I really don't feel like I know what I'm doing, is very often helpful.
I think the fun part about giving writing advice when you talk to a bunch of different people is like they always just like say all completely different things, which really just reinforces that everyone's process is different and there's literally no wrong way to do what works. And also I think that like it's different book by book. Like sometimes like, one book I'll write it one way and then another book I'll write it a different way. like outlining will work for one book and it won't work for another book. And it's just like, I mean, I think it's trial and error. So there's lots of different things to try because you may never know what is best works for you.
I was just going to add, I often make myself start writing, but in short chunks so that it doesn't feel too scary. Like I'll set my alarm for 15 minutes. I can write for 15 minutes. That's nothing. I can do 15 minutes, 20, that's nothing. I can do 20 minutes. And so even if I don't know what I'm writing, I also know that that's only lasting 15 minutes and then I'm allowed to check the internet or get a snack or whatever. So for me, short amounts of time feel less scary if if I know what the limit is.
Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one last question. So our last question comes from Emily, who asks, what is a favorite non-book medium to inspire you and your writing? Something that is not a book that gets your brain going, that fills your well. I really like that metaphor, filling your creative well.
I write about theater, high school theater people because I was a high school theater person. And so during the pandemic, not being able to see live theater was really drying. So I watched a lot of movies, which is close, but there really is no substitute for being in the theater. And just, with the mask, with the thing, I've been trying to go see as much live theater as possible. And I feel nerdily filled up and I feel like I'm 16 again, overacting on my high school stage, and it's terrific.
Similarly, something I missed during the pandemic was going into museums. I used to work at the Brooklyn Museum, and it's the art, but it's also just like that kind of really specific hush and like high ceilings of a museum space. There's just like nothing like it. And it's like it transports you. It's like destabilizes you in a really good way. So I find just the whole experience of going to a museum to be well filling.
Yeah, for me, art museums as well, and I don't think of myself as like, oh, this is how I'm going to spend my Saturday at a museum. I don't necessarily, right? But whenever I go, that is very often a time when I'm actually writing in the back of my head.
I don't know if this is like really a medium, but I think like, yeah, going for walks outside, like in nature, very soothing, very good for plotting because it's like stimulating, but not that stimulating so much that you can't actually think about anything. So it's great.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Helen, but this was an absolute joy and delight. And I hope I run into all of you soon out in the real world.
Thank you, Cecilia. That was wonderful. And to all of our panel, thank you all for joining us this evening. Emily, I hope you feel a bit better and enjoy the rest of your vacation. For everybody who joined us this evening, thank you so much. And a reminder that copies of Family of Liars are Crooked Hearts. This Place is Still Beautiful, Together We Burn, and Debating Darcy are available in both our stores, at Oblong Books in Rhinebeck and Millerton, and also at oblongbooks.com. Before I close, I would like to extend additional thanks to the great publicity teams at Delacourt Press, Flatiron Books, Balzer and Bray, Scholastic Books, and Wednesday Books. And you all know who you are. Thank you so much for helping make this event happen tonight. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your evenings to be with us this evening. Bye, everyone. Be well and have a great rest of your summer.
Bye. Thanks for having us.
Good night.
Good night.